welcome to the Book Faire podcast. My name is Anthony. April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and this week we have an interview with Kali Wallace, author of Secrets of Underhill, Ohio State Budget Slashes Library Funding, and the American Library Association files a lawsuit against DOGE for cutting IMLS. Let's begin with an interview with Kali Wallace, author of The Secrets of Underhill. Hello, Callie. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Can you start us off by introducing yourself to the audience as well as the book we'll be discussing today?
Yes. My name is Kali Wallace. I am an author of quite a few different kinds of things. I write fantasy, science fiction, some horror. The book that we're talking about today is The Secrets of Underhill, which is a middle grade fantasy adventure book. Came out in January from Koertge Books. It is a fantasy story. It's about a girl and her mother who live in this world where there is magical trees. I love magical trees. And they care for these trees and they notice that they're getting sick. And so they travel to the mother's hometown, a city in the middle of a grand old forest, to investigate why the trees are getting sick. And this leads the main character and her friends into a great many adventures and troubles and shenanigans, as is always the case.
And can you tell us a little bit about the protagonist? I believe her name is Nick.
Yes, her name is Nick. She's 11 years old. She's a very sort of action-focused girl. She works as her mother's apprentice, so she is very dedicated to studying and learning about and protecting these magical trees, which are called ironwood trees. And she takes even though it is a magical world, she has a very scientific process approach to everything, where she wants to gather information and draw conclusions from it. And she wants to make observations and learn that way, and feels very strongly that that's how people should approach the world and how people should approach interacting with the natural world, which in where she lives includes this magical natural world. Prior to the start of the book, because she and her mother move around quite a lot, she doesn't have a lot of friends her own age. And so part of the story is about Nick making friends with first her cousin and then one of her cousin's friends, children her own age, which she doesn't have a lot of experience with, but she's able to connect with them and have quite a lot of fun with them, get in trouble with them, and also end up helping quite a lot as they have their adventures through the city.
And Nick and her mother, Theo, are investigating a blight on the ironwood trees, right?
Yes. They notice that these trees are very, very important for this magical world's culture and economy, and they notice these trees have been getting sick in a way that the effects are strange and magical and unpredictable, but they can't figure out why. They can't figure out what's causing this sickness. The part of the world building in this story was to sort of combine the fantastical elements with actual natural elements. So there things like parasites and funguses and viruses exist alongside magical problems, magical sicknesses, magical parasites and stuff. So it's a combination of them looking for no pun intended, but now that I thought of it, unintended, the root of the problem with what is causing these trees to be sick, because it is their job is to care for them. That is what they do, but also they are aware that if this sickness continues unabated, then the consequences for not just the economy, but for how this culture that they live in operates will be very severe.
Right. And you mentioned that this is a middle grade book, so it's targeting younger audiences. Let's talk a little bit about how Secrets of Underhill, with this magical blight and the mix of the natural sciences that goes along with it, how is this comparable to a young reader's real life? In what ways is the symbolism in this book maybe not so much symbolism as it is potentially a warning?
Yes, no, it is. Because, yes, it's a book for middle grade, so, around about like 8 to 12 years old, generally. And the idea behind it, and the initial idea behind it when I first started writing was I wanted to write about a magical adventure with magical trees, because I love magical trees. I love the idea of magical forests. I have since I was a kid, and I vividly remember reading books about magical forests as a child. And something that sticks with you for that long, I immediately think this will stick with other kids. Kids like adventures and fantasy adventures. But in this case, it developed as I was writing. Like, once I started thinking about what does it mean to have a society that is built around, focused on using a single natural resource. And it is a finite resource. It can be depleted. It can be contaminated and made harder to acquire. It can be exploited. And all of these things follow naturally from the premise. Okay, there's magical trees. They're getting sick. People are worried that they're dying. That means that they won't be able to use them anymore. And focusing on what that looks like from a kid's point of view, but a very knowledgeable kid, because she works with her mother. She's an apprentice and they travel around. She's seen a lot of this world, but still a kid's point of view. And part of that process of writing and developing the story was thinking, what does she see? She sees all the magical. What does Nick see? She sees all the amazing magical things that can be this basically technology that can be created from these trees. She can sees how it can make people's lives better, but she can also see how people can use it to sort of basically exploit the availability of the resource, can overuse it to, cut down too many trees is a pretty, obvious metaphor. But, I was in school in the 80s when the concept and this idea of clear cutting and deforestation was all over the news. And it was very much a focus of environmental news at the time. The problem hasn't gone away, but it was something that I remember vividly, and remember where people had, there were news reports about, for example, protecting habitats in the Pacific Northwest, which is where I live now. At the time, I was not living there. But this idea of protecting forest specifically, but any sort of natural land, as a important piece of the world. So making the trees magical and tying them to magical technology, things that people use in this magical world to make their lives better, is really just a way to consolidate this environmental, notion of preserving resources, not exploiting them, managing them, environmental stewardship, being responsible in managing them, and the idea of cautious advancement and industrialization, rather than discovering something and running with it until you completely run out of resources, figuring out how to still make people's lives better without basically running every possibility into the ground.
Even in The Secrets of Underhill, in the very beginning of the book, the mayor mentions how they are outside of the main city, so they aren't under the regulations of the one city, so they can harvest their ironwood trees as much as they want, and they see that as a positive thing.
Right. Yeah. This is again, because the book is told from an 11-year-old's point of view, again, a knowledgeable 11-year-old, but she's still a child. Some of these things that are very real world economic and political issues are only sort of hinted at. But one of them is that the tension between the economic benefit of, a lack of regulation in some communities versus the long-term impact, the larger scale impact that people have, and just the very idea that the perspective that people have, for example, yes, the book opens in a smaller farming agricultural community who are seeing one kind of impact, and then the main characters and her mother move to a city where they are have a very different experience of the world. And these two communities of people, two types of communities, have to coexist using the same resources, even though they don't always have the same goals. And this is all kind of stuff that I tried to weave in there without, I mean, it's not, again, it's not the focus of the story. The story is an adventure story. It is about kids getting into trouble trying to solve a mystery. But all of this stuff impacts the way the world, like way I imagine the world, and how trying to take big ideas about, like, again, like corporate and governmental influences on how resources are used and what it means for individuals to make choices versus, communities or political groups as a whole, and simplify it all down. Obviously, it is grandly simplified down so that it can make sense in this context. So much of this, like I said, when I first started writing it, this was not really what I was planning. Like, I didn't start to think I'm going to write a book about political environmentalism for middle grade kids. What I thought was, I'm going to write a fun book about magical trees and have fun, inventing a magical forest and all these cool things to do with it. But as I was developing that, I was like, okay, how do I make this feel more real? How do I make it feel real? All of these other things kept coming in, because it turns out how you make it feel more real, more vivid, more immersive is you can't ignore the real world analogs. And so I focused a little on developing those. Hopefully the goal was not to take away the fun, but was also to be like, no, this is, it's not completely removed from the real world. Because the whole point that I came around to after much editing and revision and reconsideration is that people, like, I guess I didn't think of it this way as I was writing, but like the great theme is that, people are not separate from our natural world. We're part of it. It is part of us, and it's dangerous to view as like, well, we exist here and the natural world is there for us to use in any way we want. Like, that is not a sustainable or healthy relationship to have with the world.
As any author would probably attest to, is real life just kind of works its way into it. And so the tensions between the political and environmental, the fact that Nick is a young girl who is able to recognize this tension, that is just one aspect of it.
Right.
And the overall theme of how people interact with nature is something that is just constant, not just in real life, but throughout the story. What are some ways that you've built the magical adventure on top of this incredible grounded story of humans and nature that are inseparable?
Well, some of the most fun I had with this book was thinking of those imaginative, magical things. Like, what would a magical forest look like? And there are, like, it's not just the trees. There's flowers, there's butterflies, there's mosses, there's, birds, there's all these other things that are part of this. And I wanted it to feel very specifically, because once I realized there was this, or once I began working on the real world environmental analog part, I didn't want it to be a parallel to a specific, like, resource in our real world. And so a lot of the fun was, there's a chapter when Nick and her cousin are exploring this city, which her cousin, he knows very well. He's lived there his whole life, but it's all new to her, and seeing what all the people do with all this wood that Nick she knows very well, but she hasn't worked with on a, like, creating things level. And I wanted it, everything from using it for plumbing to like lights to artwork to music to musical instruments. So I wanted it to be like, this is something wonderful that in itself is very fascinating and wonderful, but also people can do amazing creative things with it because people are creative and innovative. So it wasn't just that, like, oh, we're just taking a resource and just, ruining it. It was like, no, there's a reason why this is important for a culture, for this community. And another part of that was simply in inventing the city in which it takes place was quite a lot of fun, because it's like it doesn't, like, it's an impossible geography in the real world. There's trees that are like the size of entire, I don't know, neighborhoods. There is an entire underground neighborhood, which is quite important to the story, where people there have like their actual bodies are like affected by this magic. So they will have, features that we tend to think of as more naturalistic than human, just again to show that with magic we can make anything in fiction happen. And one of the things that can happen is that to eliminate that line between what do we think of as forest features, what do we think of as human features? Well, there's no reason why they have to be separate. So a lot of this sort of imagination of just creating a lot of the fun, like anyone who has read one of my books, including this one, knows I love describing fun things in detail. And so a lot of that was just thinking what would be cool, what would look spooky in this moment, or what would look exciting or magical or, fun or fantastical in this moment, and just building up the layers of that.
And you said that you've also written other genres as well, and books targeting older audience as well as middle grade fiction. Is there something about fantasy and in the Secrets of Underhill that let you be a little bit more creative and expressive that you weren't able to do in other books before?
When I write middle grade fantasy, which this is my third middle grade fantasy book, and to me they're all sort of related, and in that, yes, there is a playfulness where, because we're in this fantasy genre, but also in children's books, where so much of it is about offering and encouraging wonder and like excitement. And it can be about, the middle grade books can be about dark, serious things. Like obviously, the politics of environmentalism is a serious, often very upsetting thing. But I can sort of take out the, I guess, sort of the like gritty cynicism that adults expect, even in the most imaginative fantasy, and focus on what is it like to live in this exciting world. It's the most fun, like kids playing make-believe. Try to remember what that felt like. What did I want to imagine when I was, 12 years old and wishing I lived in a magical world? Focusing on that, it really just opens up this sort of warmth, welcoming these ideas of things can be weird and wonderful and strange in a fun way, but you can still tell a story about big topics. And also very much, Secrets of Underhill is very much a family story. It's about, Nick and her mother are reconnecting with her mother's estranged family. And so it's you could put those stories, but you can still have it be this playful thing where flowers bloom and turn into butterflies, and where people can live underneath a lake in a cavern made of tree roots. And this, like, I want it to be, I guess, sorry, I'm thinking through my answer to your question here because it's a very interesting question. But I guess I want it to be what I remember reading as a kid is the books that I loved, the fantasy books that I loved, were the ones that felt inviting, like you're welcome into this world. You can imagine yourself part of it. And that's the feeling I try to recreate, especially with the children's books that I write. I want kids to feel like they can imagine themselves having adventures in these worlds.
I think that a few things that you said, encouraging wonder and excitement in writing for younger audiences, exploring darker and serious themes, and avoiding the cynicism that older audiences typically anticipate or expect in literature, kind of hits the nail on the head on exactly why I like to focus on books for younger audiences. Because it is about encouraging wonder and excitement. It is about exploring new ideas and being able to explore who the reader is through reading.
Yes.
As well as the darker themes, because children are oftentimes much smarter than they're given credit for.
Absolutely.
Nick is able to Nick is able to appreciate and understand the political tensions, even though she doesn't understand why a person would care so much about the regulations and have such a strong opinion about it when nature is such a beautiful thing that needs to be respected. But children do see these things and they do understand them a lot better than we give credit for. And I always say, anytime I see a movie with my wife or we're talking about a newer book, I can't stand when media is cynical. Whenever there's this idea that this is what the world is and it's bad because people are bad, and I don't like when stories are cynical, and that's what really drives me to middle grade fiction, especially, is because it has those themes without the darker cynicism of the older audiences.
Well, I think I think I tend to agree with you. I think there is something very reductive and oversimplifying with the idea that is very prevalent in a lot of adult fiction that, yeah, people are bad and people will do bad things. And that's just the way people are. That's human nature. I think people are people. That means people in general and people as individuals are capable of doing good and bad things. And I think that's a perspective that is very important to keep in mind as I'm writing for children. There are villains in this book, quote unquote villains, but there's still, it's like, why are they making these choices that they are? And yes, sometimes those choices are simply greed or, a want of power and money, because people do make those choices, but it is still a question of, it's not something, I guess, this is getting into sort of philosophy of how to portray humanity in fiction, but there's nothing satisfying to me to write something in which like people behave this way because humanity behaves, humanity is bad or humanity is, greedy or selfish, because people are more complicated than that. And so that is to capture that. Kids see that. Kids know when you're making, you talk to children about books they read. They know when you're faking it. They know when you are not genuine in what you are presenting. And they're also sort of delightfully unforgiving about it. It's like, no, if it feels fake, they're just not going to be interested in it. And so that's part of where this, welcoming and inviting them into the story is such an important thing to do.
And just to close out the interview, I have one final question that I ask all authors. So, Callie, how do you see yourself and the work that you do as a writer? I know you kind of tackled it a little bit about this earlier, but feel free to expound on anything that you may have touched on about how you see yourself as a writer.
Wow. That's kind of not an easy question, because I feel like it's something, I don't think I'm alone in this. You've probably heard this, that a lot of people are having to reassess these days in a world, especially where children's books are being challenged and banned for outrageous reasons, basically, and where there's such a attempt to devalue artistic creation. I think, we live in the world that we live in, and a lot of writers and artists, I think, are struggling this. I think of myself as a writer. Let me think. This is a difficult question, because it is something where I feel like I'm always kind of not sure how to define that. I've written, like I said, I've written books for teenagers. I've written books for adults, for children. I write short stories. I write novels. I write about movies in a weekly column. So I write a lot of different things about a lot of different things. And I tend to follow the whims, but I do tend to there's always some speculative element, science fiction, fantasy, horror element, because I love exploring the world just beyond the world we know, like the world that is not quite possible. But I still hope and try to maintain emotional honesty in there to make it feel real. And whenever I'm sitting down to write, I guess this is a very practical answer to your question, but I always want to write something that will make the reader feel like they are there in the story. And whether that is for the children's fantasy books to sense of wonder and excitement, or for like a horror short story, a sense of nightmarish fear. For science fiction adult books, sense of, this, although actually that's a lot of fear too. Those are almost horror books, but just to make it feel real, because I think one of the best, coolest, most exciting, most interesting things about written language and storytelling is that we can take somebody who is sitting at home on their couch with their cat in their lap and their, tea at their side, and put them in a magical world and help them go into a spaceship, into a haunted house, into a dystopian society where there's, rebellion against, dictatorship, or all these things that fiction can do. Whatever it is that I'm always wanting to do, all different ones, whatever it is, I want to put the reader there, like welcome them in and let them experience that.
Thank you. That was an interview with Kali Wallace. Her new book, The Secrets of Underhill, is available now. You can find more about Callie at KaliWallace.com. Next, we'll look at recent releases, but first, if you appreciate the work being done on the Book Faire podcast, there are a few ways to show your support. First, you can follow, subscribe, like, rate, or review the podcast on whichever platform you are currently listening. You can also follow the show on Blue Sky at BookFairPod, or go to patreon.com/thebookfair to find links to articles and resources used on the show. Following is completely free. You do not need to pay to access resources. But the easiest way to support the podcast is simply to share it with a friend, relative, an educator, or young reader in your life. Now, on with the show. Next, let's take a look at recent releases, beginning with The Cartoonists Club by Raina Telgemeier and Scott McCloud. Eager to make her own comics, middle schooler Michaela, a budding writer, joins forces with bespectacled artist Howard to establish the Cartoonists Club. They're joined by non-binary, versatile creator Art and shy talented Linda, who's working on a comic about her late father. As library media specialist Miss Fatima helps them prepare to attend a local comics convention with their creation, each faces personal hurdles such as Howard's father's assertion that comics are a waste of time and Linda's hesitance to share her work. Miss Fatima guides them in creating mini-comics, emphasizing that there are no rules, advice that proves invaluable both for the club's comics making and social navigating. This adroitly rendered graphic novel by Telgemeier and McCloud doubles as a manual for aspiring comic makers. Creative prompts, tips, instructions, and definitions features throughout, delivered in a cheeky tone that seamlessly integrates heartfelt narrative with approachable how-to guides. And afterward provides a behind-the-scenes look at the creators' energizing and informative collaboration. This book is recommended for ages 8 to 12. Next up, A Day at the Beach by Gary D. Schmidt and Ron Koertge, illustrated by Yaoyao Ma Van Az. Collaborators Schmidt and Koertge team up with illustrator Ma Van Az to explore a single day at Rock Castle Beach, New Jersey, through the perspectives of more than 24 kids in this winsome work. Beginning at dawn as siblings Jackie and Simon race across the beach before it formally opens to the public, chronological chapters, each containing a standalone narrative, progress throughout the day, occasionally intersecting to build one cohesive tale. Stories follow Tobias Jackson, whose eagerness to show off his new trim physique is derailed upon losing his phone. Hassani Ahmadi, who is on his weekly beach walk with his father, navigates a confrontation that brings up memories of immigrating from Iran. And Leslie Pearl Brown, who, resentful of the pressures placed upon her by reverend parents, converts to a new perspective. Weighty topics surrounding racism, grief over a pet's death, and contending with cancer's effects on a parent are addressed with tender nuance. Animated full-page illustrations depict the day's progression and show the racial diversity of the cast in immersive, realistic scenes. This book is recommended for ages 8 to 12. Next up is Renegade Girls, a queer tale of romance and rabble-rousing, by Nora Neus and illustrated by Julie Robine. A determined teen spending the summer with her wealthy aunt and uncle in 1880s New York City eschews societal expectations to find a suitor, instead working as a stunt reporter to expose the city's injustices in a gripping historical graphic novel by Neus and Robine. When Helena Nell Cusack learns that close friend Lucia, who also serves as Nell's family's household staff, endures grueling conditions in a sweatshop, Nell endeavors to shine a light on the systemic exploitation plaguing the city's working class. With support from photographer Alice, Nell delves into New York City's darkest corners, grappling with ethical dilemmas and confronting the powerful elites who control the city. Robine's evocative illustrations and subdued palette effectively contrast the opulence of high society with the dire realities of factory life, while expressive characters and dynamic layouts amplify the emotional stakes, capturing the protagonist's exhaustion, defiance, and camaraderie. Nell and Alice's tender, nuanced relationship unfolds against a backdrop of a rigidly conservative society, offering a heartfelt exploration of labor rights, agency, and queer identity in an engrossing, socially conscious tale that resonates with contemporary discussions of systemic injustice and personal resiliences. This book is recommended for ages 12 and up. And lastly, The Pecan Sheller by Lupe Ruiz Flores. When her father's death forces Petra to leave school and shell pecans in a factory with her stepmother Ama, the 13-year-old mourns her lost dreams of graduating and becoming a writer. In 1930s San Antonio, Texas, many pecan factories employ mainly Mexican immigrants such as Alma, who work for pennies in poorly ventilated rooms where tuberculosis spreads. Despite her dismay at leaving school, Petra accepts her new responsibilities, including helping Alma raise her younger siblings and soon make friends at the factory with two girls her age. But when tragedy occurs, Petra must weigh her family's needs with the changes promised by a strike and union should she join other laborers' efforts. Visceral descriptions of the financial insecurity faced by pecan shellers and police brutality encountered during the strikes are balanced by Petra's optimistic spirit and determination to make changes for herself and her community. Using short chapters with quick pacing, Ruiz Flores unveils intimate and well-researched depictions of the pecan shellers' strike of 1938 and its impact on Mexican descendants and beyond. An author's note provides additional historical context. This book is recommended for ages 10 to 14. Next, let's look at some recent headlines, beginning with some insights for Sexual Assault Awareness Month from BookRiot.com. April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Over half of all women and nearly 1/3 of all men in the United States have been victims of sexual violence. These are based off of reported numbers, which means that they are likely underrepresented. Girls between 16 and 19 years old are 4 times more likely to be victims than anyone else in the population, according to a study from RAIN.org. According to the UCLA, trans people are assaulted at a rate 4 times higher than cisgender peers. Why is this on a book podcast? Because since 2021, book banning has begun to grow across the United States, targeting books that are deemed to have sexually explicit content. During the 2022-2023 school year, PEN America found that the most commonly banned books were no longer those with people of color or LGBTQ+ representation. The most commonly banned books in American schools were those that explore themes of violence and physical abuse. 48% had some form of physical abuse, with half of that including sexual abuse. This matters because these stories empower victims to come forward with their assault. Or, in some cases, young children may not know they are being abused. Children's books that teach about consent and the different types of physical touch, what is allowed and not allowed, these help young people learn the words to report their abuse. When children are not educated, particularly on the names of anatomical parts, they aren't able to tell a trusted adult, meaning the abuse can continue. The second most banned book, according to PEN America, is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, which includes a depiction of a father abusing his 11-year-old daughter. 8 out of 10 rapes are done by someone the victim knows, with 34% of assault happening by a family member. Banning books like this can be a safety risk, as children who are victims may feel they are unnatural or alienated and therefore shouldn't talk about their abuse. I'll end with one final statistic from Rain. Every 68 seconds in America, someone is sexually assaulted. Every 9 minutes, that victim is a child. Next, a look at Ohio's latest budget and how it affects libraries in the state. Back in February, there were reports of a potential change of funding in Ohio public libraries, and today, House Bill 96 is currently sitting in committee at the State House of Representatives. The bill was introduced to the Ohio House Finance Committee and would slash over $100 million from libraries and require public libraries to restrict access to LGBTQ+ books in order to receive their new funding. Ohio funds libraries through the State General Fund, designated as the Public Library Fund, or PLF. This is intended to allow rural communities with less tax income to have properly funded libraries. In some communities, the PLF is the entire budget, while in larger regions, the budget is supplemented locally. House lawmakers are now proposing that public libraries be funded through a budget line item, and that those funds would be distributed to counties through a per capita formula. This would destroy funding for library services in rural areas. As written, the proposed budget would cut $46.7 million from libraries in 2026 and $54.1 million in 2027. The original budget would have increased funding. The proposal now leads to over $100 million in total cuts over 2 years. Changing the funds to a line item in the public budget now also gives the next governor of Ohio the full power to determine whether or not to fund public libraries at all. Further stipulations in the budget include moving LGBTQ+ materials into places outside of the view of people under the age of 18. For smaller libraries, this would be virtually impossible. As I've said, this proposal is currently in committee and is still awaiting a vote in the Ohio House of Representatives. It would also need to pass the Senate before being signed into law. However, this proposal is frightening and hopefully does not pass. And lastly, the ALA files a lawsuit against DOGE following cuts to the IMLS. The American Library Association is joined by the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees in a lawsuit against the Department of Government Efficiency for the Trump administration's gutting of the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The lawsuit argues that DOGE's actions against the IMLS, including firing employees, ending grant programs, and stopping all of the Institute's work, were illegal and unconstitutional. It claims that these actions violate Articles 1 and 2 of the Constitution. The organizations also say these actions cause immediate and disastrous consequences for the plaintiffs' ALA and AFSCME, as well as their members, including librarians, libraries, and the public. This lawsuit was filed on April 7th in Washington, D.C. and alleges that DOGE took actions to dismantle the IMLS without congressional authorization. The filing also points to potential damages for cancellation of grants at libraries across the country following the cuts to the IMLS. This story is relatively recent and still developing, so I'll try to keep updates coming as the lawsuit progresses. This wraps up another episode of the Book Faire podcast. Remember, there are links and resources available at patreon.com/thebookfair. You can follow for free. No posts or resources are locked behind a payment. I appreciate you for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.